Shalom Aleichem, everybody. We're continuing with our series of video Divrei Torah for the upcoming holiday of Pesach. I'd like to start off by wishing all those who are in need of refuah shlema, they shall have refuah shlema b'karov b'sol shachar Yisrael, and we shall have a Yeshua from this very difficult matzav situation which we find ourselves in. We read at the beginning of the Hagadah that afilu klanu chachamim, klanu nevonim, klanu yodim es haTorah, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'tzias Mitzrayim, v'chol amarbe l'saper b'tzias Mitzrayim harei ze meshubach, which translated means, even if we are all great scholars, even if we know the entire Torah, it's still a mitzvah on us on the Seder night to relay the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and whoever does so at great length is praiseworthy. The more you do, the better it is. And the question is why? We've all heard this story 1,000 times. We know the details. If we all know the story already, why are we obligated every Seder night to retell it? And furthermore, why do we say the more the merrier? And in typical Jewish fashion, I'd like to answer this question with another question, which is, Rabbi Soloveitchik asks a very strong question. He says, if you look in the Gemara and the Mishnayos at the end of Tractate Pesachim, the Gemara says, which section which section of the Torah do we use to retell the story of that Exodus from Egypt, to do this mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim? So we go all the way, the Mishnah says, to the end of the book of Dvarim, to the Parsha of Kisavo, and we use the section of Arami Ovid Avi. A wandering Arabian was my forefather, went down to Egypt. We were oppressed in Egypt. We cried out to God, and God took us out of Egypt. Asked Rabbi Soloveitchik, why do we choose, or why does the author of the Haggadah choose that particular section all the way in the book of Deuteronomy, all the way at the end of the Chumash? This is the section that the Jewish farmer reads as he is bringing his first fruits to the Beis HaMikdash. He gives a brief recap of Jewish history, and then he concludes, we don't include this part, but he concludes with, God, you brought us to this land, you gave me this wonderful fruit, and thank you for all of that. Why do we use that section, and specifically the part of the section where he gives a brief recap of Jewish history, recapping our humble beginnings before God brought us to the land? Why is that the section chosen? Why don't we just go directly to the book of Exodus and read those verses, the book of Shmos, read those verses which describe the slavery and the redemption from the slavery? Why do we go all the way to the book of Devarim and choose this particular passage of Arami Ovid Avi? Says Rabbi Soloveitchik the following. He says that the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is not just a dry retelling of history. It's not a dry history lesson. That's not the point of it. The point of the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is we retell the story as a means of thanking God for the redemption. By recalling the difficult straits we found ourselves in and the fact that God took us out of that, that's a way of saying thank you to God. In fact, that's why we end the whole Magid with Hallel, right? We say at the end of Magid, because you took us out of Egypt, as we just recounted the whole story, Lefichach anachnu chayavim lahodos lahalel l'shabeach lefoer, etc. Therefore, we are obligated to praise you, and we break out, as it were, into almost a spontaneous Hallel recitation. We start Hallel right at the end of Magid, right? The Thanksgiving prayer to God. That's the apex. That's the whole point of the Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim of Magid, is to retell it with the intention and the means of thanking God, of breaking out into Hallel and thanksgiving and praise. That's the point of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. So that's why Rabbi Soloveitchik explains the Baal Haggadah took specifically the section of Mikra Bikurim of Parshas Kisavo of Arami Ovid Avi. Because what is the farmer doing? The farmer is bringing the first fruits as a way, and he's recounting Jewish history as a way of saying thank you to God. Thank you. I know we had humble beginnings. We were enslaved in Egypt, and you took us out, and you brought us to this land. You gave me this fruit. That's what the farmer is doing. He's engaged in an act of hakar satov, of recognizing the good that God did for him and for us nationally. That is the point of Mikra Bikurim, and that is the point of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. And that is why the Baal Haggadah, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, took dafka the parshas, took specifically the parsha of Arami Ovid Avi. I think with that understanding, our original question becomes clear. What do we ask? For Kulanu Chachamim, for all great sages, even if we know the whole Torah, we heard this story 1,000 times, still on the Seder night, we're obligated to retell it. And the more we go into detail about the story, the better. Why so? Because it's not just a history lesson. Yes, if we could take a test on it, we could get 100 even before the Seder. We know that already. The point is the act of retelling itself is a way of saying thank you to God, thank you to the Almighty for everything you've done for us and everything you've given to us. And I think it's an especially important lesson given our current situation. Many things that we kind of, when things are normal, if you will, we take for granted, whether it be health, wealth, income, all the things we take for granted in life are really being challenged under the current circumstances. And it really makes us take pause and appreciate everything that we have and everything that God has given us. And I think, especially when we come to the Seder this Pesach night, hopefully God will give us a Yeshua, a salvation, B'kara. But even so, really the whole situation, God is kind of reminding us that, not to take things that we previously or heretofore took for granted, take for granted. And I think that's an important lesson. Come Seder night, we're engaging in an act of Hakar Satov. As Jews, that's a basic principle, a basic value, to recognize that everything we have is from God, is a gift from God, and to thank God for everything He's given us, whether it be, again, health, wealth, family, or otherwise, things that we often take for granted. It's important not to take for granted and to thank God and acknowledge God for the gifts that He has given us. I think that's very important as we come to this Seder. I'd also like to share another insight. This actually from Rabbi Soloveitchik's great-grandfather, the Beis Halevi, after who he's named, who says the following. We say famously in the middle of Magid, the paragraph, V'hi she'amda l'avoseinu v'lanu, shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu l'chalosenu, ela shebechol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalosenu, v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu mi'adam. In every generation, V'hi she'amda l'avoseinu, it's a feminine noun, he. It has this feminine noun, which we'll say in a second what it is, has stood us in good stead, that not only has one arisen against us to destroy us, namely Pharaoh in Egypt, but in every generation they arise against us to destroy us, and Hashem saves us from their hand. And the question is, what is this Vihi? What is this feminine feminine noun, Vihi Shamdal Avosenu V'lanu? So of course it's going back on the previous paragraph. It's going back on the Haftacha, Baruch Shomer Haftacha Yisrael, the promise of salvation that God promised Avram Avinu at the covenant between the pieces, the Bris Ben Absarim, where God said to Avram, your offspring will be enslaved for 400 years. They'll be persecuted, but don't worry. I will punish those that enslave you, and you will leave with great wealth and eventually return to the land of Israel. So that haftacha is a feminine noun. It ends with a kamatei. That haftacha of salvation, that promise of salvation, which God promised Avram of redemption from the 400 years of slavery, that protects us down to this very day, even against those who currently rise against us. And the Beis Halevi asks a very simple question. He says, why? Didn't God already fulfill that promise? God promised that to Avram, at the covenant between the parts, the Bris Ben Absarim, your offspring will be enslaved for 400 years, and then I'll punish those that enslave you, and I'll take you out. And God did that. Why? Finished. Why does that original promise of salvation from those 400 years of slavery still protect us down to this very day, as we say in the Hisham, the paragraph? That's the question of the Beis Halevi. So he says, to understand this, we have to really understand what we're saying in the previous paragraph of Baruch Shomer Haftacha Yisrael. What do we say? Blessed are you, Hashem, who kept his haftacha, his promise to the Jewish people. Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu chishev v'saketz lasos k'moshe nemar l'Avram Avinu b'bris ben absarim. That God chishev v'saketz, He calculated the end time to fulfill His promise that He made to Avram Avinu of redeeming His children. What does it mean? He chishev v'saketz, He calculated the end time. What does that even mean? So Beis Halevi explains. He says that really, how long were we in actuality in Egypt for? We were there for how long? Not 400 years, as the verse says, but actually 210 years. If you do the arithmetic in the Chumash, all the Chazal and the Midrashim point out we were there only 210 years in Egypt proper, not 400 years. So what happened? So we're thanking God. You know what happened? If we would have stayed any longer, if God would have left us there any longer, there'd be nothing left to take out. We were on the 49th level of Tumah, on the verge of complete assimilation into Egyptian society. If God would have waited any longer, there would not have been a distinct entity known as the Jewish people left to take out. So we're thanking God for Chishiv Esaketz. Blessed are you who kept your Avtachu, your promise to the Jewish people. And how did you do that? By playing an accounting game. You Chishiv Esaketz, you calculated the end time. In fact, Kates is Gematria what? Kuf is 100, Sadi is 90. 190, you calculated the end time. You deducted 190 years from the 400 years that were supposed to be in Egypt, and you took us out early, and that enabled you to keep your promise. But what happened to the 400 years? So our rabbis tell us either you counted the 400 years from the birth of Isaac, who was born in a strange land, which was the beginning of the exile. He was born in the Eretz Plishta, in the land of the Philistines, and the 400 years started from there. Or because of the intensity of the slavery of 210 years, it counted as if it was 400. Different accounting games, if you will. Different chishiv v'saketz, different means of quote-unquote calculating the end time. And you did all that to fulfill your promise to Avraham Avinu of saving and taking out his children. So thank you, God, for doing that. But the Beis Halevi explains, because we were not able to fulfill the simple understanding of the prophecy, which is 400 years in Egypt proper, and God had to take us out early because we were on the verge of assimilating, so we still owed God that 190 years that he deducted from the 400. And that's why the Beis Halevi explains there had to be subsequent exile, that the redemption from Egypt was not the final redemption. It could have heralded in the Messianic era. There could have been, that's the one exile in Jewish history. The redemption from Egypt could have been the one redemption of Jewish history, and Moses could have been the final Messiah, could have taken us on the land, and that would have been the end of all our trials and tribulations. Everyone would have lived happily ever after that. But because we couldn't withstand all 400 years in Egypt, God had to take us out early. We still owed 190 years of exile. And that's why there was subsequent exile, the Beis Halevi says. Now, how did 190 years turn to thousands of years? One has to say that that's kind of because of subsequent sinning. That's kind of interest, if you will, interest on the principle. But the very notion that we still have those who rise against us to this very day, that we're still in exile, the Beis Halevi says, is all because God took us out early. We thank you for doing it. If you wouldn't have done it, there would have been no Jewish people left to take out. So thank you for doing it. But because you took us out early, that's why the Gulas Mitzrayim, the redemption from Egypt, was not the final redemption, and that's why we're back in exile until this very day. But being that the case, that original promise of redemption from the 400 years still applies to us today, because we're in effect still serving that 400 years plus interest, but it's essentially we're back in exile today because God took us out early. So therefore, the Beis Halevi says that original promise of redemption from the 400 years does protect us down to this day, because really, essentially, Jewish history is really one exile and one redemption from that exile. We're still in midstream, and therefore that original promise of redemption applies to us down to this very day. Very powerful insight of the Beis Halevi. And I think it really reframes where we are in Jewish history. We're used to thinking that all the big things, big events of Jewish history have happened in the past. Yitzias Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, getting the Torah at Sinai, conquering the land with Joshua, all the prophets, all that stuff is in the past thousands of years ago. We're good traditional Jews, keeping the Seder, keeping our traditions. Isn't that quaint? Isn't that nice? But Beis Halevi is pointing out that's not at all the proper perspective. We're still midstream. We're still living the drama currently. The fact that we're in exile means that we're still mid-Jewish history. The final redemption, which is the grand finale of Jewish history, has not yet happened. It's ahead of us. And in fact, we say in the Hagadah, there's a whole question between Ben Zoma and the Chachamim. Will there be even an obligation to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim in the days of the Mashiach? Why so? The Talmud explains, because the final redemption will dwarf in scope, in size, in drama, even the exodus from Egypt. So it's a question whether or not you'll still have to mention it in the future. Okay? So really, the grand finale is ahead of us. Gulas Mitzrayim could have been the Gula Shlema had we withstood all 400 years in Egypt. But because God took us out early, that's why we're back in exile, and that's why that original promise stands us in good stead till this day. But that lets us know that the final redemption is still ahead of us. Our greatest days are still ahead of us. They're not behind us, and we're still midstream. Again, a very powerful thought from the Beis Halevi, which very much reframes where we are in history, and really puts us in the proper perspective that we're not just kind of just keeping our traditions. Isn't that quaint? Isn't that nice? No, we're still mid-drama, we're midstream, we're mid-story, with a grand finale yet to be written. Grand finale is still ahead of us. And may we be zocha, as we've mentioned many times, that B'Nisan Nigalu, in the month of Nisan, that's when the original Gula happened, Gulas Mitzrayim, but our Chazal tell us in the future, the great Gula, the Gula Shlema, which will be even bigger than Gulas Mitzrayim, also will happen in the month of Nisan. May we be zocha that just like we've mentioned in the past, actually it falls out the same way it did in that first Mitzrayim, that the 10th of Nisan was a Shabbos, and the 15th of Nisan, the day they left, was a Thursday, Wednesday night, Thursday. The same way this year, maybe we be zocha. Who knows that maybe this year will be merit with the fact that we've gone through a little bit of a difficulty, which hopefully has caused us to introspect and got rid of our personal chametz, as we've talked about in previous shurim, improved ourselves both interpersonally with our families, with our fellow man, with our fellow Jew, and hopefully between our relationship between man and God as well. May we be zocha in the merit of our personal bir chametz, of getting rid of the chametz, the leavening, which is our personal yetzer hara, our personal arrogance and ego. May we be zocha in that schus to the gula shlema. B'mehera b'yameinu amen. Chag kosher v'sameach, a good Shabbos, and all good things for everyone. All the best.